When the government of Ontario brought down its budget last month, you could be forgiven if one of the big ticket items in that budget sounded familiar. The Liberals' plan to sell off 60% of Hydro One, the publicly owned company that transmits electricity around the province. We sort of saw this movie 2 decades ago, when the then Conservative government considered privatizing all of Hydro One, but it never happened. Here to give us some historical perspective on why that sale was called off back then and whether it's in the best interests of the province to do this partial privatization today, here's Ernie Eves, 23rd Premier of the province of Ontario, former Minister of Finance from 1995 to 2001, now Chairman of Gravitas Financial, among other things. Mr. Eves, welcome. Good to have you back here at TVO.
Great to be here, Steve.
Well, again, we wanted you here because of your past experience with this. So take us back 2 decades, and what were the arguments back then for privatizing all of Hydro One?
Well, I guess the main argument for privatizing Hydro One, or any asset, I guess, is that it brings some private sector discipline to the operation. And there are those, of course, who've argued over the years that Hydro, whether you're talking about OPG or Hydro One, has sort of been out there on its own and runs its own way, and there's a lot of things that could be improved in the system. So that's the primary argument for doing it.
Not to mention getting the money back.
As I see it. Well, yes, but I think one of the things that people forget about is that there are literally billions of dollars that need to be invested in capital infrastructure of Hydro One in this case. And I don't see that this proposed sale is going to take us there. The money's going to be taken to pay off debt, and then the remaining balance, about $4 billion, as I understand it, is going to go towards transit projects in the GTA.
Okay,
not that there's anything wrong with that.
I get you, but hold off on that because we're not there yet. So you looked at privatizing it back then.
I did.
You ultimately didn't.
Well, we didn't for, I guess, a couple of reasons. I believe that if you're going to privatize something, you should have competition. And there's no competitors here for Hydro One. I mean, it is the main distribution system of electricity and power for the province of Ontario. There are some 70 smaller distributor agencies, which Ed Clark pointed out should be probably consolidated. And I agree with that. But I think we should go there first before we even think about doing the second step. And I think he pointed that out in his report a few months ago. But even having said that, I think one of the other main factor that really made an impression upon me was the cost of hydro and the cost to the consumer. And as you may or may not recall, I certainly do, there was a big debate between Dalton McGuinty and I. He was going to keep hydro rates where they were. I was going to keep hydro rates where they were. And I really wasn't convinced that not only did I want to create a private sector monopoly to deliver hydropower across the province, I wasn't convinced that you could keep a lid on the price of electricity across the province of Ontario and its distribution, in this case with Hydro One.
Of course, Ed Clark, who's of course been tasked by Premier Wynne to study all of the government-held assets and see whether or not they can be repurposed, he said this is the best solution for keeping rates lower because the private sector discipline you talked about will make Hydro One a better operating company, and therefore you'll have some opportunity to keep a lid on rates. What do you think of that argument?
I don't think that takes into account the literally tens of billions of dollars are going to be required for capital infrastructure improvements. I presume they're going to come out of the customer's pocket as well. The private sector is going to expect a return on its money. That's going to come out of the consumer's pocket as well. So I'm not sold on the idea that that is going to be the case. I think you could have looked at selling a minority interest in Hydro One to bring that private sector discipline. The problem with that, though, is that they're not going to realize as much return in the markets on Bay Street as they would by doing a majority. And I've had these arguments explained to me when I was Minister of Finance and when I was Premier. I was never against selling any asset that made sense. If it was going to deliver better services to the people of Ontario, and it was going to be cost effective, and there was going to be a competitive element to it. I mean, when you go right back to the beginning of the Harris government, we looked at OPG, what is now OPG, and Hydro One, and we always came to the conclusion then that selling the generation aspect, OPG, would make more sense than Hydro One. You wouldn't lose control over the distribution system throughout the province of Ontario. As Sean Conway put it once, I believe, he said it was like the lifeblood of the central nervous system of the province, and it was worth literally billions upon billions of dollars, and I believe he was correct in that respect. I mean, it returned $1 billion to the people of Ontario last year in income. Well, if you're on the street in the capital markets and you're going to sell a business that is regulated, a monopoly, guaranteed that you'll get at least $1 billion a year ad infinitum, the price tag would be a heck of a lot more than $9 billion, $4 billion net after you pay for the debt. So that's the problem I find with some of these arguments. I really don't think it's in the best interest of the people of Ontario to do it.
I presume that they're trying to have the best of both worlds, namely selling 60% of it so that the street gets interested because of that private sector discipline you talked about, but hanging on to 40% of it because then the public's interest is somehow safeguarded by the government of the day. Is that not a reasonable conclusion?
I always thought that 60 was bigger than 40.
It is.
Well,
but they say that no one entity will be allowed to buy more than 10% of it.
Yeah, that's all very interesting and all very interesting semantics. But at the end of the day, the 60% owners are going to control the 40% owners. And I think this is an exercise in we need $4 billion, so where are we going to find it? Let's realize this asset over here. They have a term for it. I forget what it is. You can tell me what it is.
Unlocking the asset value.
Yes, unlocking the asset value. In other words, privatization, which they don't want to say out loud. And look, I understand the politics of it. I understand all of those things. But I still think it would be in the best interest of the people of Ontario for the government of Ontario to control the majority of Hydro One.
Now, back in the day, you guys looked at it, there was an outcry, and you ultimately, your thinking evolved on it. Let's put it that way.
Yes, it did. And quite frankly, as you recall, I hadn't been in government for about a year. Mm-hmm. I was removed from the process and rightly or wrongly reinserted myself back into public office.
We should just explain that.
After a year.
You actually retired from public life.
I'd resigned as Minister of Finance.
Rather successfully, and they brought you back in.
Taken a job as Vice Chair of Credit Suisse, First Boston, Canada, and was quite happy in the private sector until my friend Bob Runciman and other cabinet colleagues, former cabinet colleagues of mine, came knocking on my door after Premier Harris decided that he was going to step aside. So I hadn't been at the table when these discussions were going on. When I left the government, there was no talk of privatizing Hydro One. In fact, I can recall being at meetings where it was stated we'd never privatize Hydro One. We might look at privatizing OPG if you could break it up into 3 or 4 different entities that would all be of equal size and could compete against each other. And I can recall a review we had done by, I believe it was Goldman Sachs CIBC at the time, who looked at OPG and said, well, gee, you know, the markets aren't that great right now for generation, but you might be able to do something over here with distribution. I think you look at the makeshift sort of system that's in the US, at least I did, and you see how broken up it is, how many different entities you have. The northeastern, North American blackout occurred because of some small distributor just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, really shut down the whole system. When you stop and think about it, it's quite remarkable. But you're only as good as your weakest link. And I think we have a great advantage here in the province of Ontario in that we have a system, even for all its faults and improvements that could be made, that is controlled by the province of Ontario.
So you wouldn't do this?
No, I would not do this.
Let's talk about booze. One of the other big items in the budget was booze.
I looked at that as well.
Which you're not drinking right now, I should hasten to add. The LCBO has always been a political football. When you first came in 1995, right, the Common Sense Revolution pledged to look at or consider privatizing the LCBO. You didn't do it ultimately. Tim Hudak said he wanted to do it. He didn't get elected. He didn't get a chance to do it. Now they're opening it up here. Going to have beer and wine in, I think, up to 450 supermarkets, stores around the province. You like that idea?
I don't think there's anything wrong with that idea. As far as it goes, I don't know how you differentiate between these 450 and these 1,000 over here. I don't know how you differentiate between, you have to be so big before you can sell booze. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me from a philosophical point of view. But I understand the political pressures, and somehow I guess hoping the people will be appeased that there's some measure of control if you have bigger entities and bigger stores selling it. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the fact. But going back to the LCBO issue itself, yes, we did look at that very seriously. And I always said, as Minister of Finance, if somebody can bring me a proposal that makes sense, we'll sit down and seriously look at it. But nobody ever did. I did have a conversation with somebody who shall remain nameless, who wanted to purchase the LCBO for some $5 billion. Well, the LCBO, it's the same argument we just had with Hydro One. The LCBO makes about $1.5 billion a year net to the government. If you had an asset out in the private sector that was a monopoly, that was guaranteed that would pay you no less than $1.5 billion a year, gradually increasing ad infinitum, you sure as heck wouldn't sell that asset for $5 billion. You might want to start talking about putting a zero behind the five because you'd have to have that money invested that could generate at least as much money as you're making now on the LCBO. So I still haven't heard an economic argument that makes any sense for privatizing the LCBO.
Let's talk in our remaining moments here about deficit reduction. You know about this. You balanced budgets when you were Minister of Finance. The Liberals say they are on track right now to balance the books by 2017-18. Based on what you know of how to get that done, do you think they can?
I think it's possible, but I don't think it's likely. Let me put it that way. A lot of things have to happen in concert for them to be able to meet that target. They have to find real cost savings, which to date, I think objectively they have not been able to do, but they've done some, but they haven't gone anywhere near as far as they're proposing to go, like $500 million a year, I believe, is the number they're talking about. There has to be real GDP growth of something like 2.7 or 2.9% every year for the next 3 years. There has to be maintained low interest rates. In other words, they can't go up by 1 or 2% between now and then. There has to be a decent international economy going on. There's all kinds of things that have to happen in concert, as Bob Ray himself pointed out in an article, an op-ed piece he wrote for the Globe on this issue. Yeah, it's possible, but not too likely, I think, is the answer.
There will be those, Paul Krugman, the economist, is one of them, who says money has never been cheaper. And governments, if they want to invest in the infrastructure that they want to, now is the best time to go out there, borrow money at 1% and get all the stuff built you want to do.
Well, government obviously can find money a lot cheaper than the private sector can. So it's not a bad argument. I don't think you should discount public-private partnerships. I'm a great believer in that. As long as it provides decent service to the people of the province of Ontario in a cost-effective manner, there's some public oversight of that. And there is some competitive element. For example, I introduced P3 hospitals, which Dalton McGuinty campaigned against and then turned around and did more than I was thinking of doing. But he didn't call them P3 hospitals, he called them something else.
AFPs.
But as I have always said, it doesn't matter to me who owns the bricks and mortar of the hospital. What matters is the service, the healthcare service inside that facility that is provided to Ontarians. That's what's important. And I think that, you can make the same argument with any one of these subject matters that we've just been talking about. What is important is, do the people of Ontario benefit from this in the long run?
Do you think taxes need to be raised to balance the budget?
I don't believe they have to be raised, no. But you're talking to somebody who lowered taxes 222 times in the 5 or 6 years that I was finance minister. And there again, I'm not saying that was the only reason the Ontario economy performed well while we were there. But it was a contributing factor, and a lot of things happened in concert. We were just talking about things happening in concert. A lot of good things happened from our perspective in concert. Almost 750,000 more people were working in the province of Ontario at the end of our tenure than when we started. They were all contributing members of society. They were all paying taxes. They had not been paying taxes before. There was a lot of corporate expansion. There was a lot of businesses that located and expanded in the province of Ontario. And I think we had some, effect by lowering taxes and creating a climate encouraging people to want to invest here.
Let me throw a for instance out there, though. If you thought taxes could be raised to help balance the books, for example, would you look at the gas tax? Because people got what is basically a $500 to $1,000 tax cut this year because the price of gas went down so much. As a finance minister, do you consider moving into that space, maybe raising the tax on gas a little bit and putting it towards deficit reduction?
I don't. Lots of governments do.
Well, these guys didn't either.
No, I don't believe in it. First of all, there's a problem with the way gas tax is skewered anyway. There's a tax on tax, which I don't happen to believe in. I mean, it's one thing to tax the basic cost of a liter of gasoline. It's another thing to piggyback on somebody else's tax, excise, federal excise tax, sales tax, gasoline tax. You're piggybacking taxes on taxes. And I don't happen to believe in that. I don't subscribe to that philosophy. I mean, there's only one taxpayer out there. He or she has to foot the bill at the end of the day. I mean, this sounds like I'm preaching the common sense revolution, but government doesn't have any money. It has money it takes from people, and it's supposed to spend it on things that the private sector wouldn't do, like healthcare, public education, protecting the environment, transportation systems. That's what government is there for in our system. So I've always been all ears about things that help deliver those services to people, but I'm not in favor of just doing it for the sake of doing it.
You sound like you've still got lots of wind in your sails when it comes to fighting the political fight on these issues.
Well, it's not really a political fight. I mean, I'm at the point now, Steve, where I can say what I think without any political repercussions or, I mean, I'm not running for anything. I'm not running for office. I watch politics, obviously. I've always been a keen observer of history and politics. So I watch it provincially, federally, municipally. I have certain ideas. People don't have to agree with them, but I think I have a better sense, having been finance minister for 5 or 6 years, having been the premier, having been a cabinet minister for about 12 years in many different portfolios. I think that I have some experience that, helps me make these, I call them decisions that are made in the public's best interest.
In which case, in our last 30 seconds, what do your spidey senses tell you about Patrick Brown, your new party leader?
Well, I think Patrick had quite a remarkable achievement when he won that convention by, 62 to 38? That's a huge, huge win. And he really worked. He worked very, very hard. He organized hard. He reached out to all kinds of different groups, ethnic groups especially, that our party traditionally has not reached out to. So I think all those are really good things. I think the discerning factor is going to be, can he apply that to a provincial-wide election as opposed to just within the party? And B, there's an element of social conservatism that rightly or wrongly has been attributed to him. And I don't believe that the general populace in the province of Ontario believes in social conservatism, but that's just my personal point of view. I may be wrong. So it's going to be interesting to me to see how he deals with that aspect. But in terms of vitality, work ethic, I mean, he really did outwork, outorganize the other opponents he had. And Christine, I have a lot of time for Christine Elliott. I think that her vision and her beliefs, her political principles are probably pretty close to what mine would be in terms of what a progressive conservative should be. But like any party, we're a big party. We appeal to people on the left, on the right. That goes back to Bill Davis's time and before that. Other parties do the same thing. And the question for Patrick is, can he bring all those elements of the party together in a cohesive way?
Ernie Eves, 23rd Premier of Ontario. As always, good of you to visit TVO. Thanks so
Thank you
much
very
for
much,
spending
Steve.
some time with us.
Great to be here.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.